Okay. Good evening, Erev Tov, everyone. So we've decided to go back to the old format of Tuesday evenings, like every other day, to divide Torah between Mincha and Maariv. Not that we need the Tehillim any less. If anything, maybe we need them more at the moment. But we have the Tehillim that we say after Mincha, and it's always a challenge. After this many days of saying the same tefillot, we spoke about on Shabbat a little bit, the different forms of tefillah and the way that we exercise that power of tefillah. It's a challenge to keep it fresh and not to get stale. Maybe we'll change the prakim that we say after every day, after Mincha, in order to keep it a little bit fresher. But in any event, people are still encouraged to continue saying Tehillim on your own time. But we will do a little bit of Limud Torah as well. It should be Latzlachat Chayaleinu, Lachzat Chatufeinu, Lefat Kol HaPtzuim, and for the benefit of all Am Yisrael. So there is a fascinating question that comes up, which has been discussed over the past 200 years amongst the poskim. Discussed for longer, but particularly over the past 200 years, and it's one of these questions, like with many halachic issues, you see the way that the society or the environment in which the posek is living and is answering the question is going to affect the considerations and affect the way that the question is answered. And what I'm talking about is, we begin this week's Sefer Shmot, Parashat Shmot. So the question of Shemot, the question of names, was going to discuss. So the Baal HaTurim says that if you look at the beginning of the Parsha, Shmot b'nei Yisrael ha'ba'im Mitzrayma, he says you take the first letter of the words Shmot b'nei Yisrael ha'ba'im, it gives you the word Shivya, which is captivity or galut or exile. And he says from there is a hint to the fact that even in exile, even in Mitzrayim, the Jewish people kept their names, and that is one of the reasons they kept their Shemot. That is one of the reasons they were redeemed. He quotes the Midrash, or he alludes to the Midrash, which says, in fact, we have a couple of different versions of this. One Midrash says, Rabbi Huna b'Shem Bar Kapara, b'shvil arba dvarim nigalu Yisrael mimitzrayim. There were four reasons why Am Yisrael was zocheh to come out of Egypt. He says, shelo shinu et shmam, they didn't change their names, ve'et lashonam, or their language, ve'lo amu lashon hara, they didn't speak lashon hara, ve'lo haya echad mehem parutz be'erva, and they were not, they did not commit gilui arayot, were not promiscuous in that way. They kept that kedusha. That is one midrash. Another one, which is probably a bit more well known, says there were three things. Right? Shaloshinu et shmam, et lashonam, et malbusham. They didn't change their names, didn't change their language, didn't change their dress. Khatam Sofer says, when it says, talking about Roshei Tevot, so he says when it says Vayavo Yaakov Shalem, he says the word Shalem is a hint. Roshei Tevot, Shmam Lashonam Malbusham, complete their names, their dress, and their language. But let's talk a little bit about names and changing names. And like I say, this is a question which has had some very interesting halachic discussion over the past few centuries. So the first one I want to start with is the Maram Shik. Maram Shik was a Talmud of the Khatam Sofer. Even in his name, you're going to get a hint of what he thinks about this. Maharam is an acronym for Moreinu Arav Moshe. And Shik is a Roshei Tevot as well, for Shem Yisrael Kodesh. That when at those going back a couple of centuries, most people didn't have surnames or didn't have a secular name, and when the authorities said he had to take a surname, had to take a name, so Maram Shik, he added the name Shik, which is Roshei Tevot Shem Yisrael Kodesh. So he writes that having a non-Jewish name, having a secular name, so to speak, is nothing less than a complete Isur D'Oraita. And this is what he says. Silence. I'll give you a moment to let this sink in. He says, don't worry, this is not the end of the show. He says, he says, I'm replying to you, your question you asked about, there are people who take non-Jewish names. ומעלתו הוכיח אותם, דהרי אמרו במדרש שבזכות זה שלא שינו את שמם, זכינו לצאת ממצרים. So he says, writing the tshuva, the question I said was rebuked about this. He says, we see in the midrash, one of the reasons, one of the outstanding things that Bnei Yisrael was zocheh to Yetziat Mitzrayim, because they did not change their names. והם משיבים שלזה די במה שיש להם שם יהודי לקרותם בו לעלות לתורה. So this is what presumably it's a Rav or whoever asked the Maram Shik. He says, I've been telling people they can't have a non-Jewish name. And they say, what's the problem? We have our secular name, which we use for business, which we use for whenever. we also have a Jewish name. So, but they they call me whatever it is, John or Peter or I don't know what. And when I get called up to the Torah, then you have the Jewish name, Yamod, and they have that, and that's enough. Meaning they haven't lost their Jewish name; they've just taken a name as well. Says the Maramshik as follows. He says, "Zed davar hevel v'tipshut." He says this is ridiculous. There is a Torah prohibition in having a non-Jewish name. כמו שכתב הרמב"ם, מהלכות עבודה זרה, מדקרא, מלא נאמר בסוף פרשת קדושים, ואבדיל אתכם מן העמים להיות לי. ומשם יופיעים בספרי, דהיינו לדמות להם בשום אופן. You ask, where do we find Isur D'Oraita having a different name? So he quotes the Rambam from Hilchot Avodah Zarah. We know there is an Isur of B'chukotehem lo telechu. I won't get into the parameters now. Just say, spoiler, most of the poskim would not take it to this expression. Everybody agrees there is an Isur of Chukot HaGoyim, of taking on non-Jewish practices. The question is that we discussed it once in the Tzubam Rabbanan Shiur. According to many poskim, it's only a practice which is related to Avodah Zarah, or is related to idolatry or sexual promiscuity. In any event, the Maramshik learns that this extends also to having a non-Jewish name, taking it from the nations around. And he says, "Ein rasha'in ledamot lahem b'shum ofen, v'kol shu oseh ledamot lahem over ma shene'emar b'Torah, de'isur lanu." אסור לנו לדמות להם. We cannot imitate them in any way. וכשם שאסור לנו לדמות להם במלבושם ובהילוכם, just as you cannot imitate them in your dress and in your practice, בשם מנהגיהם, so too, he says, כל שכן, אסור לדמות להם בשמם, also with their names, ועלינו לעשות כמו שעשו אבותינו. We have to do what our forefathers did. Now we'll see in a moment, that line is going to pose a big problem for the Shita, because if we look back and see what our avotenu did, going back throughout Jewish history, in every generation, you'll find Jews who had non-Jewish names. And we're not just talking about people who left the fold, so to speak. We're talking about some of our greatest sages. You go all the way back to the Gemara, right? You find names. Tosfot quotes, there is a Rabbeinu Peter. Rabbeinu Peter appears in one place in Tosfot. Peter, to the best of my knowledge, is not a very Jewish name. It used to be, you say. Maybe, maybe not. You go back, there was a great Sephardi sage, the teacher of the Ben Ish Chai in Baghdad, Rabbi Abdallah Somer. Abdallah is not, again, his Hebrew name was Ovadia, but he went by the name Rabbi Abdallah Somer. You go back, you go to the days of Chazal, right? What are we talking about? Modern times for Greek names. Antigonos, Antigonos Ishtocho is a Greek name. Alexander is a very popular Jewish name, all throughout the ages. So the Maramshik says we're going to have to answer that. He says but we should keep our Jewish names, do what our ancestors did. And he quotes the pasuk. This we say in Haggadah Shel Pesach, right? Vayisham legoy gadol. They became a great nation. Darshu Chazal Melamed Shiur Israel Mitzuyanim Sham. Mitzuyanim does not mean like in one Hebrew. Mitzuyan is excellent, but it means distinct. They were distinct. They were different. They had their own names. Now he bases all of this on a Tosfot. There's a Tosfot in Gittin, which quotes Rabbeinu Tam, who says that if you have a Yehudi Mumar who comes along and he leaves the fold and he changes his name, you don't put that name on a get. He says you can't put the name of a Mumar, a name connected to Avodah Zarah, on a get. So the Maramshik quotes that. He brings that as a support for this idea that you shouldn't have a non-Jewish name. What? We'll get there. We'll get there. But let me just read you the end, what he says in the Shuvah. We're not going to have time to see the answer to this, but we'll carry on tomorrow. So he says like this. It ends off the Maramshik. He says, "Ani masir kama pa'amim b'drashotai." He says, in my drashot, you know what Rabbi spoke about 200 years ago. He says, this is what I've mentioned many times about this Isur. V'kol yamai izarti et banai uvnotai el Isur ahu. I warn all my children about this prohibition. B'ezrat Hashem, lo shamati shilmadu chas v'chalila la'asot k'ma'asim shel hakalim hanal. He says, they've listened to me on this. They haven't taken on non-Jewish names. ואוי לכל בר ישראל הנאמן להשם לתורתו להזהיר את פני ביתו ואת השרים למשמעתו. Says everybody should warn all those who listen to him. או ככה בשומע ישמע ותבוא עליו ברכת הטוב. And that will be a good bracha. Okay, we have to remember the Maramshik, as I said, is a Talmid of the Khatam Sofer. He is in an age where assimilation, enlightenment is rampant, and many of the people taking on these names is a symbol. It's not just having a name for the sake of a name for convenience, but it's a name which with the intent to leave the fold, and that maybe can help us understand why you're so harsh about this. We'll see tomorrow. We'll fast forward to the next century of Moshe Feinstein is a slightly different approach to this question. We'll discuss that tomorrow.